Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Property Trio. I'm here with my co hosts, and we're covering Housing Innovation Part 2. And we've got a fair few ideas to share with you. And in the spirit of sharing, no judgment, we're just trying to list some of our ideas and think about this in a little bit of a different way, and hopefully send this off to some of the pollies out there and give them some thinking tank options as well. So, getting started, I'm going to just run through what we covered off in our part one, what constitutes a healthy property market. And we've got some notes here. Consistent rental market with a stable and reasonable vacancy rate. The ability for first home buyers to be able to participate without a six-figure salary, having to wait for a life partner or needing the bank of mum and dad chipping in. And for people to be able to move between houses with minimal impediments, so they're in a home that better suits their needs or it's fit for purpose. The necessary supply of government housing available, so those living below or around the poverty line have access to low-cost housing and are not forced to live on the streets. We have determined that auction clearance rates are a really good gauge for auction markets. And we've also highlighted investor purchasing not exceeding 1/3 of all purchases. But to add to that, Dave, I'm going to ask you to chime in.
So, look, basically my thinking in terms of trying to create a healthy property market is all about supply, supply, supply.
Yeah.
Sound like a politician.
Yeah. So I think like if we're able to fix a lot of the supply issues and mean that we have the number of houses required for everybody to have a house to live in, I think a lot of the other problems will dissipate and disappear. So my focus would be actually purely on supply. And that, that might put off some investors out there or some people who work in the property industry. But really, I think that's where it starts. And I'd set a few goals around that. So like, number one, fix supply so there's enough property for everyone. Two, let's agree on what is the right balance of owner occupiers and renters. Now, historically, it's been around that sort of 2/3, 1/3. Let's pick a number and agree upon it. And then within the investor mix, let's decide how many mum and dad investors do we want. We don't want to take away that aspiration. And let's say, currently Mike's been quoting 91%. And let's say it is 90% or 85%. I don't know, but let's pick a number, and then pick a number of how much government social housing do we need to provide as a percentage, and then how much build to rent corporations do we want, stepping into the property market and assisting renters, and then develop a framework to measure that. Let's say it's every 6 months, and once any of those numbers start to get outside of the target range, have already some preset strategies to bring them back and put them in place. So the final one is strive for a percentage of affordable housing in all locations, let's say around the median value of that city. So particularly, our critical workers like AMBOs, teachers, nurses, police are able to live, near where they work. Doesn't matter how expensive those suburbs are. So for me, that would be some of the key goals that I would set, which I think would help limit a lot of the noise and, possibly like what we're about to do, coming up with way too many ideas. Yeah. But that, I feel like that, you need to set a structure, framework, and some clear goals that are agreed upon. Otherwise, we're just going to keep having different parties, different vested interests throwing up lots of ideas and just stuck in this melees that we're already in.
Well, I take your point, Dave, that supply is the answer. There's no doubt about it. But if we circle back to, the healthy property market and the points that we've just discussed, what are the issues that are contributing to bad health?
Yeah, so some of the issues just contributing to bad health. So the New South Wales Productivity Commission said the need for more investment in scale of public housing, the high cost of financing. Now, I think they're particularly talking about developers there. Yeah. Bad weather with obviously climate change, rising material and labour inputs matched by decreasing productivity, low market capacity, number 5. Number 6, labour market competition. from welcome and historical large infrastructure builds. So we're losing skilled tradesmen to working for the government instead of building us houses.
Yeah.
7, ill-targeted thin capitalisation changes. I actually don't know what that means. Maybe one of you two.
Was that one of yours?
No, this is the New South Wales Productivity Commission.
Oh, right.
Planning delays, number 8. 9, ever-changing and disruptive state property taxes. I think we can all relate to that.
Yes.
10, red tape. I think we can relate to that. I noted a few of mine as well. So yeah, lack of supply, which has sort of touched on a lot of that. I think the 10 to 12% of all our wages that we can't touch in super to buy a home. Stamp duty, which is sort of part of those issues there. And I do think the prevalence of short stays is having an impact as well.
That's an interesting one to point out, because I've seen a couple of studies, certainly of specific areas, where the beat up about short stays is excessive compared to the problem that it's actually causing. And we've got to also think about where short stays tend to be. Granted, you can go into a regular suburb and spot a few short stays, but typically they're in, the coastal areas, or they're in the city, the heart of the city, where people do need short-term accommodation. And we've also got to consider where short stays are appropriate, where they actually fit well, because you get a lot of people staying in short stays because they're in a distressed situation and they need something like that. So, there is a time and a place for short stays.
I 100% agree. I think that's part of what makes solving that problem so difficult, because often they're causing a problem, and it could be in a small country town on the coast, and that's often possibly the case. Maybe they're in a city like Hobart, but there's such a high concentration of them where there's an undersupply of property, and it's in and around the best locations. And so, people can't rent close to the CBD potentially. So I do think it's very nuanced, the short stay discussion. So I think that actually really is a tricky one to manage appropriately. Yeah.
The University of Queensland did the most oft-quoted study on Airbnb, and basically concluded that it was not responsible for, say, Queensland's rental hike. So from a national point of view, it's a moot point. It's a grain of sand. But as you're saying, Dave, you take that to a tight little coastal community that's maybe a holiday style destination like the Surf Coast, which you guys would be way more familiar than even me. But I also kind of like the idea of, I suppose this is like a capitalist and free market idea, is that where a problem shows up, we need the flexibility for a solution to be provided, right? As far as I understand, there's been very few hotels or extra accommodation built in that location. So people are jumping in to try and fill that void. But of course, the negative impact would be the pool of long-term rentals is diminished because people are chasing those dollars. So perhaps it's just like a per LGA local council cap or something like that.
Yeah, I think something like that would be a good idea. And but look, I think your point's right. Like, probably of those 15 issues we've just noted, it's probably the smallest one.
Okay, let's move to the idea of investors. And I might not have a popular consensus here, and that's okay. But by the time this becomes a really big burning issue, so a broader and more painful issue than what it currently is, by the time that happens, the government might suddenly look at the situation and say, we can't create enough new housing to sort this out. We're actually now in crisis in this nation. And we really do need investors to stop selling, and we need the numbers that we've got plus some. When that day comes, and I think it will, what are they going to do to tackle getting investors to either not sell or to start purchasing? Because as you've said, Dave, there's an equilibrium. We don't want no investor participation, because otherwise, our stock will decline and eventually we'll be at a really awful crisis. So how do you think governments and politicians could try and get investors to stay and to participate without losing votes? It's going to be a really tricky balance. I've got a few ideas. but I'm going to get you two to share yours first.
I remember a panel interview where you were on the panel, Cate, with Stuart Weems and Terry Ryder, where the Shadow Victorian Housing Minister asked you, what can we do to incentivise investors? Now, I think it was Terry that responded, but it could have been either one of you, because I think you were all in agreement, is that, well, investors don't really need incentives. Historically, they haven't needed incentives. Negative gearing is, I don't think it's enough to say it's an incentive for something that's been around for like 130 years, right? It's not like it came out and like, oh, now we're jumping on the bandwagon. What investors just need is a lack of disincentives. And that's what we've really seen happening all the way back from 2016. And you can see a beautiful little line where rental supply drops in concert with changes to lending and interest-only caps and the 2 negative gearing elections and minimum standards and Queensland land tax scares and every Greens press release in the last 5 years. So I just kind of think they need to be recognised for the part that they play. And I think investors need a reasonable time horizon where they feel confidence in the policies. So like Dave mentioned, this messing about on the edges at the periphery, changing this, changing that. I really think if a state government wants to make a major housing reform, they should plan to taper it in, or let's say this is going to start in 5 years' time, and then give the world a chance to present the evidence to the contrary to it, sort of like what happened with Queensland, although it was such a tight time frame, people had to jump in pretty quick. But even then, they still say that they didn't repeal it because of evidence. It was just like the states wouldn't play. But I think people need long-term time horizons where they don't feel like a decision they're making today could be wrong because someone changes the rules later on in time.
Yeah, I agree with you, Mike. Obviously, I sat on that panel and totally agreed that removing some of these onerous reforms and just taking away the disincentives would be a step in the right direction. And I maintain that the notice to vacate 120-day no reason being taken away was probably the biggest slice of loss of control for investors that our state government could have tampered with. So historically, you'd have an arrangement with a tenant, you'd have a lease in place, which is the contract between you and them. And when the contract comes to an end, you'd have the option to offer them another contract. So let them sign another lease and stay on in the property, or you'd call it and it's time to move on. And we don't have that provision now. If you want to vacate a tenant for no reason, at that point, you can't do it. And that's been really difficult because if you're having a problem with your tenant, if the relationship's soured, if they're not paying, if they've done things to the property that you're uncomfortable with, you can take them to VCAT. You can go through the tribunal process, but that's a really horrible way to do something, and it's an awful way to have a relationship with someone that you've got a contract with. And if you're sick of them and you just want them out because you can't deal with the headaches or they've been late payers consistently, that's tough for a lot of investors. So that was the main one that I spoke about. But let's assume the government goes beyond just removing the disincentives and they're really calling for investors to ride the storm or to stay involved or to get involved. I have a couple of additional incentives to share. One is to consider LVR. And at the moment, we've got really attractive LVR deals on offer for medicos, and Dave, you'll be right across this. No LMI at 90% LVR for people that have high incomes and are considered low risk borrowing candidates. Now, I don't know why investors aren't considered in a similar light when it comes to servicing the loan, because you've obviously got the help of the tenant. And I would have thought if there's an opportunity there for lenders to assess risk, investment loans I would consider are less risky up to a certain rental return threshold. So that was one idea that I had. Another one was a stamp duty concession for investors, maybe a 50% stamp duty concession, provided the property goes onto the rental market. So that might exclude short stay, and it certainly excludes properties where the owner wants to be able to stay there, for example, holiday houses. And my other thought on all of this was potentially the government deposit scheme as per the current first home buyer scheme where no LMI is charged. And so it's essentially covered, it's insured, underwritten by our government. So they were my ideas that won't skew the market and won't take opportunity away from first home buyers, but could see investors who were sitting on the fence consider that it's a cheaper entry to get into the investment housing market.
Yeah, look, I agree with your point that if we can't fix supply, we're probably going to end up with too few rental properties owned by investors and social housing and build to rent, and that's going to become a real issue. And if it gets to that point, we do need to focus on how do we incentivize investors. And like Sun Tzu said from The Art of War,
here we go.
If you can't have tactics without strategy, and you can't have strategy without tactics. So, or you're destined for defeat. So, I'd start with the strategy, and I think I'd break it into 4 key areas. I think you've got to reduce the expense for investors. It's got to be less onerous for investors to be landlords, and they need more rights. You've got to make it easier to access finance. And I think it's got to be nationalised, because one of the reasons we have so many issues in our property market is because of the different systems between the states. So that would be the strategy from a high level, that I would focus on those 4 areas. So, we can then work out the tactics. So you've mentioned some of the tactics there, Cate, in terms of it being too expensive, in terms of it being too onerous, in terms of it being too hard to access finance. Now, I'm not going to sit here and suggest necessarily the tactics for around expense and onerous, but obviously we can land tax and stamp duties, etc. And we can unpack those. Obviously, I'm more of an expert in finance. So I think some obvious ones are to make the interest rates the same for investors as owner-occupiers as they were for a long period of time, maybe even less, maybe even cheaper. There's less defaults on investor loans than on owner-occupier loans as a cohort, because generally they've got greater wealth. So you actually can take more risk with them in theory, but lenders probably don't want to do that because they want to be seen to be supporting owner-occupiers. But if we get into such a problem, then that makes sense. Higher LVRs, like you've said, we can look at longer loan terms, as you've said. We could maybe look at more flexibility around interest only. We know it's tax deductible. Look, I think there are there's a number of tactics we can put in place in any of those 4 areas. But they're the 4 areas of strategy that I would focus on.
It could be really targeted as well, Dave. You and I both know that banks are very good at targeting purchasing away from risk. So, for example, postcode risk. We could use postcodes as a target for actually encouraging investment into areas where vacancy rates are really tight and really hampered. Even if it was just focusing on a select few, that would make a very fast difference if we had these offerings in place.
That's a great idea. The lenders obviously do monitor postcodes and pick out the high risk ones, and generally it's the ones where there's high supply, too much supply and too much high density apartments being built. So it's really the opposite, isn't it? Target the ones where, yeah.
Mike, what are your thoughts in relation to the investor side of things?
Yeah, look, I think this discussion could be looked at, okay, what's the problem today? And let's talk about 10 and 20 years time from here. I think the problem today is that we've got a lack of willingness from politicians to firstly educate themselves and understand the problem, but then also give the shout out to investors as doing the lion's share of the heavy lifting for providing roofs over people's heads. Right now, we do actually desperately need more investor participation. So I think we want it to be the right sort of participation. So I like the idea of moving to a model that's seen perhaps more in European countries where there are a lot longer lease terms. I don't think people in Australia that are renting are against long lease terms. I just don't think it's ever anything that's really kind of been offered. And most investors that hopefully listen to our show or take our advice, they're not flippers, they're not hot spotters. They might be interested in the growth locations, but they're investing for 10, 20, 30-year time horizons. So an investor that's wanting to participate in the market and, let's say, sign up someone on a 5-year lease or have rented a property for concurrently 10 years, I think should be able to access a CGT exemption. Of course, they're still going to be paying profit on their tax, and there's a strong argument to say, well, what did the government do to help them to achieve that, right? I think the argument is nothing. But we've also got the huge supply problem, and I see it as two problems. One is a lack of efficient mobility. So we have people in the wrong homes, and I think stamp duty is a real inhibitor of the free movement of people across different types of properties that are best suited to them. And then, of course, we aren't building enough. Now, there's a million different things that can be done there. Dave sort of talked about, pulling resources away from residential construction into the government pipeline of things, but we do actually have a labour shortage. So the government really needs to invest in those skills, invest in some of the materials that really are unlikely to keep pace from a domestic point of view, like timber. We've lost swathes of timber plantations, so that'll be a requirement for us to import a big chunk of that over the years. And I think we do need an investment in housing innovation. Like every now and then people will talk about research and development, concessions and credits. I think there's a huge amount of new technology that's being seen in the construction space, but we haven't been incentivized to adopt that. And the construction world is a little bit behind the times in some degrees. We had an argument with the New South Wales building commissioner, who was kind of having a go at quantity surveyors at large, because the time it takes to actually construct a dwelling hasn't changed in 20 years or something like that. What he sort of fails to understand is that a lot less people die on site today than they did 20 years ago. So a lot of that is OH&S requirements that the government themselves have brought in, but there's no disputing that things can be done better. And I think, Dave, you also mentioned about the importing, say, labour resources in the construction sector. We've actually seen a lot of unions very active in blocking that construction labour from happening. So I think we really need to look at the machinations of the union influence in things like the construction sector, just to get a better idea about what's going on and perhaps what's holding us back.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really great one that obviously they got left out of the latest updates to the skilled visa program because of the union pressure on labour. So there's not as many skilled tradesmen coming in. And I saw a stat that over the last 20 years, that's been the case. Only 1.8% of permanent migrants who've arrived have had construction trades. So that's clearly been a pressure that's been put on the government from unions for at least 2 decades. And that's stymieing, what we're able to do in residential construction, because we know the difficulty of finding skilled labour is part of the problem as well for builders.
Yeah.
And look, as you sort of said, Cate, we can look at things postcode by postcode, and the banks seem to be more adroit at that than, say, governments do. Governments will come up with a policy to say, look, the serviceability buffer we're going to come up with is X, and then not look at that seemingly ever again until something happens and they look at it. So really the government could be saying, here is an LGA that's crying out for development, so we're going to create a development fund that allows developers to have access to reduced interest rates for the construction of types of projects that fit what we need in that area. I think the government needs to really invest in a housing fund and think about the ways that it can incentivize people to construct, right? And it's not too dissimilar to the Housing Research Institute's policy and what is actually sort of going through Parliament with the shared equity schemes. And I think those are capped at about 40,000 a year or something like that. It doesn't strike me as big enough to make a huge difference.
Broad.
But yeah, the government has to get involved, and social housing as a proportion of all the housing we've got available. If you look at us comparing to other countries, we're a long way off the podium, and the government really just has kept a pretty flat 4% of rental stock, and really they need to come to the party a little bit more.
Yeah. Now, in all of this, we've always got to consider the plight of the first home buyer and also lower household income families that are keen to get onto the property ladder. And you've made a few notes here about how we can continue to support first home buyers and also people that have less earnings. I'll get you to share that with us, Dave.
Yeah, so a few of the notes we've put in here. So Mike's actually said more flexibility on LVR requirements and interest requirements, and a serviceability change to match for principal place of residence buyers. Then I've noted, I think we could increase loan terms, which we've talked about in the last episode, and LVRs. I think one we really should look at is factoring in the age and reducing the servicing buffer for younger people, given we know that due to inflation and obviously our incomes grow, but also our incomes tend to grow much more from when we're younger until we're like middle age or even older. So I think you could actually create greater flexibility, in serviceability for first home buyers who are, under a certain age. I think there's a space for that. Mike also tabled the first home buyer shared equity program, but expanding it up to, for example, 80,000 applications a year. And look, I think we've done some in this area, but I think we could really beef up the support for single parents. I think, that's probably the hardest, the most challenging cohort is single parents in particular, and then, just anyone who's trying to buy on their own. How can we make it easier for singles to purchase?
Yeah.
Because one of the big, demographic changes over the last 2 to 3 decades is just the percentage of two-income families versus what there used to be. So that's been possibly the biggest impediment over the last 2 to 3 decades, is if you're a single person, it was much harder than it ever used to be. Sorry, Kate.
No, you're right. It's a good point to make, because that statistic has changed and it's worsened, and they are more vulnerable, and it is much harder because they're competing against dual income earners when they're standing at auction. I think our federal government introduced a great opportunity. The problem is it's just too small. The offering is too restricted. So unlike the first home buyer 5% deposit opportunity, they've also got a 2% deposit opportunity for people that fit the criteria and are eligible. But I think it needs to be opened to far more people. And I also think that the threshold for the purchase price needs to be higher, because let's be honest, a single parent will need a more sizable house than a single person or just a couple, because they've got children. They might just have one child, but they might have 4 or 5 children. And so having a cap on the amount that they can spend where the cap currently sits is a little bit unrealistic in my view. And I think we need to open that opportunity to far more people so that we can have more market entrants.
Yeah, I think that's a real area for opportunity, is to actually, let's figure out what is the cohort, how would you define them? What do they look like? What are their demographics? What are their ages, single, etc., that finds it hardest to get into the property market? And let's say, the cohort that has the greatest challenge is 5% of the population, let's say, and they might be 20% of all the first-time buyers. You can actually create an avatar, if you like, or a model, and have some policy rules targeting that specific cohort. Because let's face it, it's not baby boomers who are talking about this majority. It's not going to be Gen X's majority. It's not going to be people who already own a home. So who are the people we can help the most to get into that first property in particular, and have a plan that captures more of them?
Yeah, absolutely agree.
Now, let's chat
about... Sorry,
Kate. This is left field, maybe a little bit of a rant, but I would like to limit the noise of some of the voices that blame other people for their own predicament. Now, I'm not talking about social housing. We have a huge need for social housing in the country, and I think as a nation we agree that there are some people that are less fortunate that ought to be taken care of. And I think with the embracement of the NDIS, that's was a real game changer for people with disabilities in the country, and social housing has some key parallels there. But I think getting your own home shouldn't necessarily be super easy, right? Now, that's probably going to annoy a lot of people, right? But all of us in getting our first homes really had to graft. We had to make sacrifices. So I think there's a cohort of the community that have just much more of an expectation. And I think it's really challenging our values as a nation. You know, there's a lot of people that say, oh, look, there's quintessential Australian values that maybe immigrants can't understand. But I think it's kind of simple. And to me, it sort of goes back to, you know, some of the diggers, right? Australians were known as being tough, resilient, great sense of humor, and, you know, got stuck in and got stuff done. I think that's a really important value that actually a lot of immigrants can teach us about, like the oft spoken about immigrant work ethic, right? Like that kind of fits with quintessential Australia. But I think perhaps Australians are losing that work ethic. Now, in a way, I'm going to wish that I hadn't said that, and I'll probably get hate mail for it. But just so that we all jump on this sinking ship together, does anyone want to join?
You think we're all becoming entitled, Mike?
Yeah. And you know what?
Look,
I'm the youngest, right? So I'm
Yeah.
I'm expected to be
You're-
able to be like
You're
you know, you
most able to
boomers,
get away with that. But look at, do you know what? I think it's actually a really good point, and it is part of the picture, and it's something I have noted in my notes. I think it was in last week's notes. I mean, some of this is a function of being the wealthiest nation per capita in the world in many measures. If we're either first or second in most measures, okay, and so that means that property prices are going to go up. That means we are a destination nation. So we get a lot of people who want to come here. We get wealthy people who want to own properties here, who send their children to live here, to study here, etc. So it is a function in a way of our own success and our own opportunity. Just to support your points and hopefully keep a few listeners on side who otherwise we're going to tune out.
Well, yeah, I'm just hoping that at least that cut the hate mail in half. I'll get 50% and you'll get the rest.
Well, to slightly change the topic, I would just love to ask both of you, you know, your thought on support housing for critical workers, because obviously that's a cohort that we desperately need as well.
That's a problem that we kind of saw borne out in places like Byron, right, which had the highest median house price in Australia. I don't know where it's up to, but it's gone through.
Fallen a fair bit.
Yeah, I know it sort of came off the peak, but even still, I think it's kind of disproportionate to buy something there for the people that actually work there. And you think about Byron, it was kind of like a beatnik, hippie sort of surf thing. It was kind of like the antithesis of money and wealth and capital growth. But of course, there are cafes, there are hotels, there are laundromats, and nobody that works in those situations that are typically lower paid than, let's say, some of the Sydney-siders that have moved up there and live like kings. We need a workforce in those locations, right? And like you said, doctors, teachers, you know, ambulance people, paramedics, I think they call them. We can't have them out in the boondocks, not allowing them to participate within a city because, you know, they don't work for Macquarie Bank or something like that. We've got to think about making sure we maintain a diversity and we maintain those critical functions of a working city. So, look, I think there's a million ways to do that. Developers could be given concessions based on allowing a certain amount of their stock to perhaps be retained by the developer or for sale under caveats that it has to be for these types of workers or people under a certain level of income, and the investor may get incentivized for purchasing those. And maybe it could form an agreement under like a social housing umbrella, because often that's what happened, right? The government will give money to a social housing provider. They'll take a head lease and then they'll sublease that to the people that they're supporting. There's no reason that that model can't be used for professional people as well.
Yeah, no, granted. Now we're getting close to the end of our episode, but just to touch on a few other incentives and ideas to share on our list, let's chat about increasing supply, expansion of crisis accommodation and funding to address homelessness, government investment in skills and trade shortages, and investment in timber stocks, which I think you touched on. Now that we're coming towards the end of our episode, I've just got a couple of others on the list here that we've all put together. Expansion of crisis accommodation and funding to address homelessness, and government investment in transport infrastructure to establish a number of zones within 45 minutes commute of capital cities and major regions. Government departments to be relocated to key selected regional areas. So broadly speaking, government employees to transition to regions to some extent. And we've seen examples of that. I talk about Ballarat as a great
Geelong.
example. Consumer Affairs is there. Geelong, as you mentioned, Dave.
TAC.
Yeah, we've got a lot of decentralised services. We've got the ATO. I think they're still in Albury. So we can do it. I think doing more of it has a lot of merit.
There's a lot left, isn't there? Look at Canberra. Let's slice that in half. Let's get their median house price sort of in line with the rest of the country.
Yeah. R&D accelerated concessions for construction industry technology. Minimum time requirements for the turnaround of development applications for a resi. That would be a great thing. Phase out stamp duty for broad-based land tax. Well, it's a big one that deserves an entire episode of its own. First home buyers having access to super for deposits when overseen by a licensed expert. And I think those last words are really critical, because I'm very fearful about touching super and buying a dud. I think we could make a real mess of things if it wasn't overseen by a licensed expert. Relaxation of zoning restrictions in capital cities. Rent investors not being able to lose that first home buyer grant, and currently that's in place. Rent investors who haven't had their first home still have access to that grant. We need to try and make it a little easier for non-residents, and not all non-residents are the same. I think that's the critical thing to say here. We might have expats that would like to get involved. And we've talked about short stays, but we could have a look at having a location bias for that, so that we can identify the areas where they're having a negative impact. Dave, I'll let you share some of these, because I know you've penned some of them.
Yeah, look, I think we need to start making it a bit easier for developers at the moment if we want supply to come online. So
in terms of finance.
So finance, talking to one of my son's basketball coaches who's a developer, works in development business, just the amount of taxes that they pay, that really cuts into their profit margin. I think developers' profit margins are just getting smaller than they really need to be, given the amount of risk you do have to take on board when you're developing. And we can make all sorts of jokes about developers and their, I guess, potential for maybe not at times building the best quality properties, but at the end of the day, we do need developers if we want to fix the supply issue. So I think the government really should look at some ways to support them. And another way is insurance premiums are quite expensive, and so maybe look at the government supporting, particularly around costs that are due to damage or delays due to weather, given that's an impediment brought up by the New South Wales Productivity Commission. So I think just implementing some of the Productivity Commission's ideas, so it's not actually directly related to property, but if we become a more productive country, we're going to be able to build more property. We're going to build it faster. We're going to continue to grow our wealth per capita, which makes it easier to own assets, and we have a better standard of living. So I think that's part of the picture. We need to provide more incentives for tradesmen to work on residential construction projects versus infrastructure. And, how do we do that? Decide the simplest framework for build to rent to support local social housing numbers, getting to where they need to be. without impacting the, as I touched on as one of the goals, the ability for dad and mums to be landlords. At the moment, build to rent feels mired in, they feel like it's not profitable enough, and in Australia, so we need to have a solution and a simple framework. I do think, and it's modular and prefab housing, not everyone's cup of tea, but there is a place for it. And particularly for those cohorts where it's harder to get into property or own and hold property. We've seen, it is hard and it requires a large scale and low variability of output, but we've seen it work in comparable markets overseas. So, and the banks have to get on board, because at the moment they probably won't accept that as acceptable finance. So you've got to get banks on board in that picture.
Yep, agreed. And that the last point that we've got, it's a bit of a clanger and it's an episode in itself. I'll let you touch on that, Dave.
Well, look, just higher and broader GST.
So the question is, would we get voted in?
Maybe not. But
it's a big call, isn't it?
It's a big one. It's a tough one politically. Yeah,
I'll just call you Paul Keating.
I think you're in your third term as Prime Minister, and you're not too worried if you don't. You're possibly on your last legs, and you might be looking to pass the baton on anyway. That's when you try and bring that in potentially.
Yeah. It's scary stuff. Mike, what are your thoughts?
Look, I think we've covered off some absolute beauties, but at the end of the day, I think we've got to stop pointing fingers at people, and investors are the obvious one. And if you think about housing affordability, we often focus the lens on the first home buyer, but not the renters, right? And renting is an important part of the country. Like, we can sort of say, like, okay, everyone's an aspirational homeowner, and I think that's an Australian value, but you have to start somewhere. Not everyone will stay with their mum and dad until they're in their 30s and have a big enough deposit to be able to go and pull the trigger. A lot of people will have to exist in that rental market, and with the shortage, it's eroding their savings. I think the data on our savings rate is horrifying. I think it's single-digit percent. Even if it gets to a single-digit percent, we aren't really good savers in general, and it's going to make it a lot harder if we don't have a proper supportive rental market. And we've seen the damage that's caused by pointing the finger, by pulling the rug under investors, and that's where we got to where we are today.
Yeah, so well said. Now, we're not going to do gold nuggets, because we've had about 50 gold nuggets that we've shared in today's ep, but it's definitely food for thought, and it's rigorous, and everybody debates it. I'd like to think we're in a safe space here and we don't get 1-star reviews, but we've penned all of these different ideas, and it just goes to show, when 3 people that know a bit about the property industry put their heads together, they can come up with quite a few. Imagine the abundance of additional ideas that we could get from other people in this who have a role to play in this industry, if we had a bit of a think tank or some interaction. And I think that's the key for our governments to be encouraging input, and something that I feel very passionate about. I've had my say many a time when we've had the opportunity to share, and I think that's something that we all owe ourselves if we do have something to say.
Yeah, this episode really highlights how difficult the challenge is, doesn't it?
Indeed.
I mean, all the ideas we've shared today, as we know, running businesses ourselves, ideas are easy, execution's the hard part.
Yeah, very true. So on that note, look forward to seeing you guys next week.
Cheers.
Have a great week, everyone.
See you later.